Cecilia Kang, author of An Ugly Truth, Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination. Frances Haugen, advocate for accountability and transparency in social media. Aaron Simpson, Director of Technology Policy at Center for American Progress, and moderated by Charlie Warzel, contributing writer at The Atlantic and author of the newsletter Galaxy Brain.
Hello. Thank you. So this is the one where we solve it. And we have 35 minutes, so we should get it done pretty quickly. We've done a lot, we've heard a lot about analyzing the problem. We've also heard some solutions, but we have here before us a group of people who have dedicated so much time to thinking in a future-forward way, in a productive way about all these problems. And I wanted to start with Cecilia to sort of give the state of play here in terms of Washington, D.C., but also your reporting, your extensive book-length reporting inside Facebook. You have this understanding of what's happening inside these organizations, but also what's happening on Capitol Hill. Just sort of walk us through, what you see as when we are trying to imagine a better social media. Like, what are the guardrails in which that conversation is being had at the moment?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Charlie, for convening this panel. So I think it's helpful to sort of zoom out a little bit and look at history as a guide to sort of level set expectations, because I think that anybody who looks at Washington right now, and even after listening to, for example, Senator Klobuchar talk about the struggle to get she mentioned one bill that she proposed in 2018. It is still sort of like introduced every session and has not passed. Things don't seem like they're moving. But I might be a little bit, I dare to say, a little optimistic. If you look at history, we might actually get a better sense of level set expectations. It's going to take a long time, but the solutions are going to have to be from the regulatory perspective, as well as from the consumer perspective, as well as from the companies. I'm least sort of optimistic about that last piece. But I want to talk about, and I think illustrative is to look at actually a hearing that Frances was the witness of last fall, where several members of the Senate panel described that moment with a whistleblower from within Facebook revealing so many problems from within based on documents, et cetera, that so many lawmakers said, this is the big tobacco moment. This is the moment, right? I think I counted more than 5 lawmakers described it as that. Not a bad example. Facebook hates when they're compared to tobacco because fairly, it's a different product. But it is a good sort of analogy in the sense that it took 50 years from the first medical reports that showed that tobacco was harmful to our health to a whistleblower in the 80s that came out from within the tobacco industry that showed that there was documented problems from within the tobacco industry, to state lawsuits, to federal regulation, to where we are today. And it took consumer behavior to change. So those appear to me to be all the components that need to be in place and that we have to think about when you think about change and solutions. We will drill into some of the regulatory aspects of it, but on the regulatory front, it's not going to be one thing. It's not going to be break up the companies alone, and if you agree or don't disagree with that. It's not going to be just privacy. It has to be sort of many things. And the good news, again, and I promise again, I will be optimistic, is that the conversation is getting smarter. I've been covering this for a long, long time, and sometimes I just go to these hearings, and I remember the earliest ones with Mark Zuckerberg in 2018, I was just like, oh my God, what a distraction, some of these questions. But I think Congress is getting smarter. I'm not saying they're smart. They're getting smarter, on what the issues are, what the technologies are. And one of the most promising things that I've seen is the conversation move away from let's regulate types of speech that are on platforms and more towards let's look at the system. Let's look at the design of the technologies, and let's think about if there are ways to regulate how things get amplified very quickly, whether companies should disclose when things go viral and how they go viral and give consumers control of that. So there's a lot to talk about today, but I think that generally, I'm going to be the optimist maybe on this panel. Maybe there are others.
Well, it'll take time. And I think it's a good frame for this because there are ways in which you can take the headline of this panel, Imagining a Better Social Media. Like I reject the part of that looks for easy solutions, but also like going so future forward here, because like in my writing reporting, I think about this as, like a printing press level, multi-generational problem, and, coinciding with rise of inequality, rise of the far right, all sorts of different things. And we look at it and we say, okay, so what tweak can we make to the code to fix the world? And that is just a really difficult place to be. It's a way to set yourself up for failure. Aaron, you think about this all the time, and also from the framework of like what role, should the government be playing in here? What can it do? What can it do? But also in the way of how do we think about? I think you said to me backstage, sort of imagining a less bad social media instead of a perfect social media. But can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to end up echoing some of this optimism and this cautious optimism. So at first, getting to a better social media is just going to look like getting to a marginally less bad social media. But I'm here to say that is worth doing. That is worth doing. These are the technologies that are interoperating so many of our social relationships and our world and how we understand each other. And so we've heard throughout this whole conference that there's just not the silver bullet for this thicket of cultural issues, political issues, technical issues that are at play in this conversation. But rebuilding our information ecosystem in the long term to protect civic values, to protect public interest values, starts with actual steps that we can take right now, that we are talking about to address different parts of the problem. We heard about some of them this morning, right? The tech antitrust bills, passing robust federal privacy, incentivizing greater interoperability, requiring greater transparency, making our consumer protection organizations more robust. We can do this. And particularly, we can start this kind of small progress soon, right? The tech antitrust bills are close. And I really encourage you, if you care about disinformation, even if you're sort of new to competition issues, take a look, because we're just not getting out of this with sort of the monoculture of social media we have right now. We're going to need competition. We're going to need better rules to enable whatever better social media looks like to grow. And I'm happy to talk sort of more about what I hope that looks like, but I imagine we'll get into it quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely, we will. And what I love about that sort of framework is it's something I notice in reporting all the time, which is that the quote unquote boring stuff, the least sexy stuff, is the stuff. It's always the most interesting stuff. It's always the most impactful stuff. But a lot of reason when we're talking about the conversation getting sophisticated, a big part of that is one of our panelists here coming before with not only a remarkable trove of information to share, but also I think the way that you framed this conversation around design is incredibly important for just changing the way we think about this. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about how what the next step is and what you are what you are advocating for now, because one of my fears too about this whole conversation is that it gets stuck, it gets saturated. We all know what the problems are, and then we start to kind of tune out. But you were talking about a sort of a product safety angle earlier, Baxat. Tell me what's on your mind right now.
So the big thing that I've been talking about since the first Senate hearing was about a framing of, we've been talking a lot about censorship for a very, very good reason, which is Facebook knew that no one could see behind the curtain, like no one could see what's actually happening. And so we had to rely on them for framing what should we talk about. And they knew we would never agree on censorship. Like you look at the oversight board does not have oversight over Facebook as a whole. They only have oversight over specific judgments on should this piece of content have been taken down or left up. The thing I've been repeating since the beginning was we need to be thinking about linguistic equity, right? Because linguistic equity and product safety go hand in hand. Instead of focusing on censorship systems where we have to rewrite them over and over and over again, right? I just came from testifying in Berlin, which is why I'm yawning, and I'm so sorry. Like I flew in yesterday. I pointed out there's 27 countries in Europe. Like I went to Norway, there's 5 million Norwegian speakers. They don't have safety systems. They might have a handful of moderators. I guarantee you the Ukrainian moderators, there's very few of them because so few people speak Ukrainian. The reason I brought these documents forward is Facebook knows lots and lots of ways to make these products safer that don't involve content. And when they don't involve content, we can do them in every language in the world. It's about questions like, if Alice writes something and Bob reshares it and Carol reshares it, so now we're beyond friends of friends. If Dan has to make a choice, if there has to be intention, if there has to be a human in the loop to spread that content further, not just an instinct like a click, that has the same impact on misinformation as the entire third-party fact-checking system. I never want to hear Mark Zuckerberg again talk about how he's learned that sometimes you have to be unpopular to stand up for something you value, and he's a defender of freedom of speech. Why don't we cut the reshare chains at 2? Then we're not judging which ideas are good or bad. I think there's a really big opportunity in the next year to start setting norms on, hey, we knew all these things you could be doing to work on virality, to be working on what the levers are that are causing the misinfo. What is the floor for negligence? What about for kids? What's the floor for keeping under 13s off the platform? Because right now, Facebook's bragging about keeping 600,000 kids off the platform in the last year. But they have documents that say that 20% of 11-year-olds were on Facebook for some cohorts. That number's probably even higher for Instagram. So if we can begin establishing those standards around what does minimal product safety look like, there's a number of large class action lawsuits that are coming through right now that want to say, hey, you're responsible for the consequences of not being anywhere near the floor. And I think things like our consumer protection groups can also use those standards.
Well, I want to, there was when Senator Klobuchar was talking earlier, answering the question of how do you measure quality? I feel like we get into these, right? We talk about the norms. Norms take time. They take buy-in from people. But I felt that the answer to how do you measure quality is very vague because it's a very difficult question to answer. But when you say these norms, what are you thinking of? Just
Sure. Norms fall in a lot of dimensions. Some of them are organizational, right? One of the things that a document in the disclosures calls for is do you have the people who set what content can be on your system? Are they in the same reporting chain as the people whose job is to keep governmental officials happy? That's a choice, right? That's a characteristic of some orgs and not of others. Twitter keeps those chains apart because they naturally are in conflict. Politicians are going to say, hey, you took my content down. And then that conflict gets resolved somewhere other than the CEO. That's a kind of choice, and it has real consequences on the safety of the system. Other things are like transparency. I think part of the reason why Twitter requires you to click on a link before you reshare it, I don't think anyone was censored by being required to click on a link. That choice causes 10 or 15% less misinformation, just because people have to choose to spread the information. I think Twitter does that because they also share 10% of all the tweets with anyone who asks. They know they're being watched. We can ask that as a characteristic of organizations. What transparency are you doing? Are you allowing other people to make judgment calls about you? And so I think that these are the kinds of norms where we can start to have conversations on at least what the 1.0 version of the norms are. And we can keep getting more sophisticated as we get more data, as we have more conversations. But I think very rapidly, if we even did a first draft, we would see there's actually pretty big differences between the social media companies that we see today.
Ethan, you are looking into the orb and look towards the future, in a sort of a different way, in a way that is asking us to actually imagine something different and something better. The idea, I've referred to the platforms as failed states a lot of times. So how can we move forward on that? And you have been doing a lot of work on digital public infrastructure based around civic values, not maximizing profits. Can you tell us a little bit about that vision?
So let's go back a little bit before we go forward.
Great.
So Professor Stone said something really extraordinary yesterday. He said that he sees social media as the greatest threat to democracy in the world today, which is saying something when you literally have an army rolling through Ukraine.
Sure.
We are 11 years past the Arab Spring, a moment at which we watched people literally overthrow dictators using social media. We've changed our opinion rather radically in the last decade or so. And for some good reasons, right? 2016, we saw the power of mis and disinformation, not just in the election in this country, with Brexit. We have woken up, and now we have a sense for what the stakes are. And you have extraordinary people taking extraordinary risks to make sure that we know about these situations. We have amazing leaders like Senator Klobuchar going out and trying to give us a legislative structure. But almost everything we've talked about for 3 days here is about making Facebook less awful. I don't want to just make Facebook less awful. I actually want to build social media that is good for us as individuals, good for us as citizens, good for us as neighbors. We can do that, but you got to start from a different place. Nothing we've talked about, none of these networks like YouTube or Facebook were designed to be healthy spaces for us to have conversations with one another. Facebook was designed to make people keep clicking on it so it could serve as many ads as possible and suck out as much personal data as possible so it could target those ads better. We can engineer spaces that try to make it possible for people to have civil conversations with one another. We can engineer spaces to help people find their friends and neighbors and talk about local issues. We can build spaces that try to increase the diversity and reduce the homophily of conversations. We're not doing that. We are, at best, looking at these systems and saying, how do we make them less awful? We have shifted media systems before. If you go back to the 1960s, TV sucked. It was basically
Vast wasteland, right?
a whole bunch, you've already stolen my line, it was a whole bunch of rigged quiz shows, lightweight sitcoms. Newt Minow takes a look at this in 1961 and says it's a vast wasteland. Minow doesn't respond by shutting down the television networks. He responds by starting in motion the funding of PBS and NPR.
Right.
So the key here is not to take I Love Lucy off the air. It's to figure out how we build Sesame Street alongside it.
Can I ask to this, and this isn't exactly what you're talking about, but I think examples of smaller community-based social networks obviously exist. I look at the various places I've lived since Nextdoor started, and I've watched these things devolve. I've also watched WhatsApp groups, of people devolve during COVID into just true horror shows. I'm curious how you think about building these communities and these structures and the way that the design can actually lead to that healthy thing, because it's not just about the scale or the fact that this many people are on it. Scale is super important, but you can still mess it up.
There's at least 3 things you have to do differently, right? The first is exactly as you said, scale. Human beings don't live in communities of 3 billion people. There is no such thing as a community of 3 billion people. There are human communities of between 30 and 3,000 people. And we need to be thinking about building social networks that work on those scales. Those social networks need to be moderated. We moderate each other in spaces. You are moderating this conversation. We moderate ourselves in all sorts of different spaces. And moderation can't be a cost center. It can't be something where we hand it over to poorly paid people in the Philippines to flip through 3-ring binders and decide whether speech is there or not. That needs to be governance. If you rethink how social networks work so that the people who are participating in them are governing the spaces, they're deciding what speech is acceptable, they're deciding how to moderate it, you actually end up strengthening democracy. You're giving people that opportunity to be involved in a society and involved with the rulemaking process. The trick is we have only done this a very small number of times. You can look at small examples like Front Porch Forum in Vermont, which actually shows a way of doing Nextdoor that isn't toxic and isn't healthy. But we are not investing in this. And the radical thing I'm going to say, and particularly at University of Chicago, I think we should tax the crap out of surveillance advertising companies. I think we should create massive public funding to do 2 things. One is to audit these existing networks and make sure that they work the way that we want them to. And the second is to fund a wave of experimentation in building social networks that we govern, we control, that are non-commercial, that are non-surveillance, and actually work to benefit us as individuals and citizens.
So when I think about that, I think about the fact that one way to get people to participate and involve in that is also at the same time to, make the big flashy platforms like better, right? Because these things have to work in tandem. I don't think people are just going to jump, especially when you have that scale and saturation. When it all sort of makes me think about getting down to brass tacks on it. Well, do you have something to say?
But it's a question of push and pull.
Sure.
Right. That right now, people don't actually get to see what they're consuming. Right. Like people are not aware of like, for example, all the content on Facebook can be largely divided into two pools: content you asked for and content you did not ask for. Right. So content you asked for is like you asked to see content from your friends, your family, groups you actually joined, pages you actually followed. And then there's things like if one of your friends commented on some other post and Facebook decided to put it in your feed. Or someone invited you to a group, you didn't even accept it, but Facebook put that content in your feed for 30 days and you happen to click on something and now you're in that group. Like Facebook knows right now that when they give you more content you actually asked for free, you get less hate speech, less misinformation, less nudity. But you don't get to make that choice because you don't know what's even happening to you. And so it's wonderful to have alternatives, but if people don't get a chance to see what the choice is, they're not gonna make the choice.
Right. Well, and I think one way to look at this that we don't talk about enough broadly is that we give the algorithm this wizardry power, right? This thing is it's pushing us everywhere. We have no control over it, and also to be almost more defensive about the fact these things are actually kind of dumb in the sense that they think that our preferences are what we click on. They don't take us as three-dimensional human beings with hopes and wants and needs and dignity into play. It's literally I liked it, and so I think that part of the conversation. Aaron, do you think that the conversation is sophisticated enough right now in order for us to sort of reimagine the things that you would like to see done?
Yes. I also call those things auto magic, where they want you to think that it's not, there's people behind the curtain carefully calibrating and coding what's going on, right? We have this sort of poverty of language when it comes to talking about digital products, especially consumer tech. So much of this conversation has been just the parameters defined by the industry, the vocabulary we use. We're just catching up socially, culturally with how we want to think about these things and how we want to make different political choices with how we're referring to sort of what's going on. And I think the conversation is getting a lot more sophisticated, right? We have, sort of woken up. We've had a whole conference about this problem. And we're starting to ask for these alternatives, right? And one of the really promising things about alternatives is imagining alternatives to, go to the name of the panel. But this is what's been a little bit hard about the tech antitrust fight, is helping people think about they're actually your Prime's gonna be fine. But also, e-commerce doesn't have to just look like Amazon. Search doesn't have to just look like Google. We have a bit of a lack of imagination when it comes to what consumer tech would be because these markets have been so stagnant and so bogged down. And so when we get to greater competition, when we put a floor down on let's stop a surveillance, extractive, non-consensual business model, and laws can do that, right? We can just say we actually don't want that. It's bad for people, it's bad for democracy. The business model innovation, the product innovation, we want pluralism in our information infrastructure. In the same way we talk about pluralism sort of with media as an important part of democratic society, pluralism with our information infrastructure. The information ecosystem we have online, there's a lot of exciting things that we could do, and I think we're just starting to reach for those, right?
And I think one of the reasons when we're at the reality level of this, one of the reasons for this lack of imagination is the fact that these decisions are being made by a handful of people. Cecilia, you report inside these companies, you talk to these people, and I think an issue that's come up in your work is the lack of diversity in this space in every possible way. We're talking geographic, we're talking of geopolitical, everything. A lot of white men making those decisions in those rooms. But what do you see and how do you think about that as part of this poverty of imagination.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I think it's so important to, and you cannot underestimate how the lack of diversity at the very top within the boards and the concentration of power in leadership at these companies have these downwind effects, 100%. So it's really extraordinary that there is, and it's actually unusual at this point, that Mark Zuckerberg is still in charge as a founder CEO 16 years later of a company. It's not $1 trillion anymore, but it's like more like $700 billion, but still a lot of money, worth that much on the markets. And he still has, at the very end of the day, the last say on the big decisions. We're seeing right now Twitter, there's an interesting individual, richest man in the world, who just bought a big stake too. There's so much stake. And the thing that I found in my reporting is that there is actual, like, a through line between some of these decisions that happen and the consequences that have on users, especially global users, who are in places where some of these leaders have never even thought about, nor have traveled to, nor have had lived experiences in. These are people, individuals who are in charge of companies, white men, often surrounded by people who have the same sort of pedigree as they do, and they've not lived life. And we're seeing them kind of come up with their own philosophies on the fly. I mean, we've seen that, and we wrote about this in our book, as well as many people here and so many other reporters. We've seen Mark Zuckerberg is a great example, go from not having to think about policy to giving a big speech at Georgetown and then realizing, oh, maybe I wasn't so right about politicians, and maybe I wasn't so right about, so maybe I'll create a Facebook oversight board, and maybe I'll do all these. These are all these sort of like twists and turns that he's making that's very tied to his personal development. So I think diversity is incredibly important, especially if you're a global platform. You're not going to have the number of people who speak the many different Burmese languages, and that are commensurate with the number of users you have there, unless you prioritize it, unless it's part of your lived experience. And I think that's so critical, and we're seeing the consequences of that. Name your country. We can point to India, we can point to Ethiopia, we can point to South America. It's just so critical. So when I think that cannot be regulated, but it's a norm. Maybe that's a norm that you're talking about, that I think is, you cannot underestimate that. So when I see more, frankly, and I'm sorry there's so many white guys here, but so I see so many rich white guys who continue to continue to sort of strengthen their power around these important platforms for speech. I wonder, where are their inputs,
I'd love to build on that if I can.
Yeah.
One of my favorite examples out there of a successful alternative social network is built by a group called Assembly4. Assembly4 is a collective of sex workers in Australia who were deplatformed from Twitter and Backpage by Zesta Fosta. So well-meaning, but ultimately incredibly damaging legislation that made it really dangerous for people who were engaging in sex work to be on commercial platforms. These women started building their own alternatives on servers. They won't say where they are for fear of getting them shut down. They ended up building the largest alternative to Twitter out there. It was called Switter.at. They had to shut it down about 2 weeks ago, thanks to the Australian government. They built something called Tryst, which is an alternative to Backpage, which continues to be widely used. One of the extraordinary things is that most of the innovation that we're seeing in this space right now is from people for whom existing commercial tools do not work. We are seeing groups that have been deplatformed, that have been chased off of other services, building their own networks because they have to. You look at Archive of One's Own. This is the leading archive of fan fiction. So these are people writing extensions to copyrighted works. They have a women-run, women-governed social network that they programmed entirely themselves that serves 5 million people a year. These are extraordinary experiments, but they're being done by people who could not find places on these existing networks. What could we do if we actually looked at this and said, what would it mean to be building a network that is owned by people in the global south, that is owned by people who are not well served by existing networks? We've had almost no experimentation in that space.
Francis,
And we have to have that conversation, right? Like I think a thing that is I try to always repeat in every public appearance I make is there's like 1 billion users or more on Facebook. It might be as high as 2 billion. The internet is Facebook, right?
Yeah.
For probably a majority of languages in the world, 80 or 90% of all the content on the internet in their language is only on Facebook.
That's right.
And yet Facebook's business model cannot extend safety to them. Because just like Amy Klobuchar said earlier today, they made $55 per person in the United States. They made about 14.5 in Europe per person. They made 4.5, excuse me, in Asia, and they made 2.5 in the rest of the world. And so the places that are the most linguistically diverse, the business model currently cannot offer them safety. And so remember, and they don't get to choose to go anywhere else because the internet, Facebook bought the right to be their internet.
I have a question. Well, actually, I'll let you respond.
Yes, I'll respond briefly, which is just, I think scale, we can all sort of sympathize, right? Like, oh, billions of pieces of content a day, so much, the scale is a lot. But they have built the infrastructure to sort of profit off of all of your clicks, right? Like they are watching people in every language, in every place, doing what they're doing. So there's a little bit of an asymmetry here in the infrastructure we've built to keep people safe and the infrastructure we've built to turn a really robust profit. And so it's a little bit of a David and Goliath argument here when it does come to scale. And it's important to think about, like, we think about digital platforms as having really low marginal costs, which often they do. Like, software is really fungible, that's great. But those costs are high and they are externalized, right? Like they're externalized onto people when you don't build the reporting infrastructure to think about harassment. They're externalized to democracy when you don't have Spanish language labels for your election policies. And so part of this is thinking about where are the costs, where are the profit centers, and how are we maybe internalizing some of those costs as well.
So we have to get to the Q&As in a second. So I'm going to kind of parrot a question that Kara asked, because what are we all doing if not copying Kara a little bit, right? And if you were, emperor for the day or had your magic wand to wave in any part of this imagining a better social media, and one thing we're not going to probably get to is like the idea of like how do you actually force Mark Zuckerberg into accountability? Like, and I'm talking like true accountability.
Yeah.
How do you actually do it?
No.
But so it can go from there, or it can be to like this is the platform I would build and seed with like 10,000 wonderful human beings to get going. But what's the thing you would do right now? And I'll just go down the lines.
Yeah.
Cecilia.
So again, I'm a journalist, so I don't have an opinion, but I have an observation from my reporting.
There it is.
So, lowest hanging fruit, or whatever the idiom is. It's transparency. I think that there's regulation and transparency. It's like so fascinating the papers that you revealed were really fascinating this way, to show how the systems work. And I think that transparency and how things go viral, how things are ranked. A quick anecdote, during I wrote a little bit about the back and forth between Facebook and the White House over COVID misinformation. And a lot of it, the struggle was basically just on the company not wanting to turn over data and they're saying this is a privacy issue, but it's all anonymized. It was just like not giving the denominator of like how big the problem of misinformation is, turning over that information, compelling the companies through regulation perhaps to show how ranking systems works when things go viral to researchers maybe to begin with. Government is trickier sometimes when it comes to handing over data. But it sounds sort of mundane, but I think lowest hanging fruit, that's a good place, because let's be honest, before we go to big solutions, we still are figuring things out and understand or educating how the systems work, the technologies work. And I think, yes, solutions are good to and there's some obvious ones out there legislatively and with regulation, but let's not kid ourselves and be a little bit humble and to understand we need to actually get the companies to reveal more so that we can understand them more.
Every healthy conversation needs a moderator, and we need Q&As to go. So everyone's going to be quick.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
So I already gave you the notion of taxing surveillance advertising and funding from there. I'll throw one other out. We don't really have public broadcasting in this country. We have voluntary broadcasting. It has very little government subsidy. It's mostly money raised by the audiences. Europe really does have public broadcasting, and they invest significant amounts of money in it. They should be building communities like the ones that I'm talking about, that people govern and people use for civic conversations, the good news is they're talking about it. We're not generally hearing those conversations, but there's amazing work being done by groups like Public Spaces in the Netherlands. We should pay more attention to what's going on there.
I want to re-amplify the message for transparency and the idea that we need more people at the table. Like I usually try to stay away from saying like, you should do the following 30 things. Like there's easily 30, 50 things that you can pull out of the documents that are just obvious things you should do. But I try to stay away from that because we got here because not enough people sat at the table. And so we need transparency and we need to fundamentally change how we educate on these things. Because right now we lack even the basic lab bench to teach classes on these kinds of product safety changes. And because you can't have an intern on your congressional staff, no one is sitting there pushing people, being like, hey, there's an alternative other than censorship.
Well, in a dream world, as much as I would love to fund, 1,000 indie social media and journalism startups that reflect the communities they serve, I'm not in a dream world, but we are in the real world, Charlie, and we can actually support tech antitrust legislation that we could get done by the end of the year. That would be a part of this problem that's worth doing.
We are in the real world. We know it every day. Questions for our fine humans here? We'll go in the front, I guess.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm Alex Fizoso. I'm a first year at the college, and my question revolves around, towards the start of the conversation, you guys did a great job talking about how we can prevent the rapid spread, the conscious decision of a pop-up window will show up before you actually send out some controversial or content with filled with disinformation. But my question revolves around the first send or the source of the information. How can we meet people where they're at that are actually providing the primary source of this disinformation, and whether it be our parents or family members or people in our community that are the reason it's being put on these platforms in the first place?
I think it's hugely important for us to differentiate between are we talking about a problem of bad content and bad people, or are we talking about a problem of amplification networks, and particularly inauthentic amplification networks? So when your uncle, your mom, whatever, sends something that is misinformation, very, very often, those are not random messages. Like Facebook does a very, very, very bad job at taking down networks. They have the technology to find the networks. They underinvest in the actual people that come in and say, actually, that is a network, and we'll take it down. Or a shockingly high fraction of influence operations on Facebook are caught with Twitter's data, right? And that they find those networks and then they mirror them on Facebook. And so the source of a lot of these problems are there's 10,000 plus people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people in adversarial nations that are actively trolling through the content and figuring out what to spread out. And I think that's a much, much bigger part of the problem.
Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. My name's Van. I'm a fourth year, and I'm in Tech Team, a group that Aaron co-founded. At the IOP.
Cool.
We've talked a lot about regulating Facebook here. We've talked about, how there are language disparities and fact-checking. And Facebook is an American company, so in some ways we have a unique way to be able to regulate them, but these are all different countries, and they all use Facebook differently. For instance, I think in Myanmar, 100% of people use Facebook, and it's the main communication. And so, if we regulate it here, that might have large impacts in other countries. And so I guess my main question is, to what extent do we have can we regulate how Facebook acts, because that makes just such large impacts in other countries? Do we have the right to be able to make these large regulations when we're essentially impacting other people who aren't being represented in that sort of regulation?
I'll start. Hello. Thank you for volunteering with Tech Team to help the nonprofits around. It's so cool to be back at the University of Chicago. That got me my start, and so grateful for a University of Chicago education and an Institute of Politics education. Loving this full circle moment. I think picking up on the thread of humility when it comes to these kinds of things. So as the American Congress, we both we're legislating from a very particular, a partial point of view. And we need to recognize that what we do will have really huge ramifications, and then think those through, but also know that the real power sharing is going to come from us understanding how we can work with other nations, other democratic nations, to be thinking about human rights, civil rights, protecting those. And the more that we can do transatlantic work, and work not just with Europe, but like with the whole world, to uplift people who are also trying to make a better social media, then that's what we should be doing, because we do have sort of a unique place, given that they're American companies.
There's a really complicated dynamic that comes to platforms like Facebook, particularly in closed societies. There are real verifiable examples of how Facebook had enormous positive effect. You can very much trace the fall of the Ben Ali government in Tunisia to videos that are spread on Facebook that are amplified over Al Jazeera. That is a real story. So trying to figure out how you shut Facebook out of societies where it can be used in really dangerous ways has double edges to it. At the same time, there's places where we know that companies do not understand how these tools are being used and the impacts they're having. Once it became clear the effects of Facebook in Myanmar, you had organizations on the ground say, hey, Facebook, you keep talking about how you have local advisors. We think we are your local advisors. We can't get you on the telephone. And if we are your backup, you are failing. So there have to be ways that we look at platforms and say, if 100% of Burmese who are online are on via Facebook, if 95% of Nigerians who are online via Facebook, there need to be real presences in those countries of local hires who understand the political situation and understand danger associated with speech. The problem, as Francis explained, is those companies are not making money in those countries, and they cannot and will not afford that. This is a system that economically does not work very well, and we have to start looking for alternatives to it.
And they chose to make it that way. They chose to go into those markets because they were afraid of, say, TikTok emerging out of those places, that if they didn't play there, something else would grow up there and disrupt them. And so, like, we need to say, hey, Facebook, Twitter did not do this. Like, they stayed out of a lot of countries. You made a choice to do this, and you should be responsible.
I want to ask a perhaps dumb question on that, which is how do you mandate anything like this? I really feel that at the end of the day, the big struggle is how do you push towards this? And obviously, there's ways to leverage the pressure, but I mean, how do you mandate that? That's a corporate restructuring question.
I think it's a question on liability. Right, like right now, they're the very first class action lawsuits about some of these tragedies, and I think part of the problem is that we have accepted Facebook's frame of reference for so long that the only thing to discuss was censorship, and we're not talking about that question I said before about the content you asked for that you consented to and the content you did not consent to, right? They should be responsible for those choices, and so I'm hoping that conversation opens up more broadly in the future.
Do we have others? Sir, over there. Oh, I don't know. Do you have whoever's closest to your microphone, truly? Oh.
Hey, friends.
Hi.
Hi, Joan.
Hi. So Joan Donovan, Harvard Kennedy School, Shorenstein Center. Check out our SoundCloud. No, I'm just razzing at Charlie. Sorry. So I'm really wondered. I'm having a problem with 2022. I mean, what we usually see during the midterms is a lot of rapid fire testing of different tactics and procedures of disinformers. The shift from 2016 to 2020 was remarkable in the sense that you had real politicians and their allies willing to burn their accounts for this big lie. What do you anticipate is coming? And if you could come up with one intervention in the short term that everyone in this room could write op-eds about and maybe create some kind of peer pressure before 2022, how could we do that? Simple question, solutions panel, happy to be here.
So one of the things that people always come back to on the freedom of speech question is there was like the solution to bad speech is good speech. And part of the problem is that narrowcast misinformation started being a huge issue in 2020. Like, part of why my team got formed was they caught Russians targeting misinformation at police officers. I think Facebook has the ability currently to segment the US population in like a privacy conscious way. Like, they don't say this group is X, it's just there's a number on it. Facebook should have to publish what the most popular 1,000 posts are every week in each of those 600 segments in the United States. Because right now there's literally no opportunity to counter misinformation. That misinformation that is targeted at a specific community may not raise to the level that third-party fact checkers are willing to fact check it, and it's definitely invisible to people that are outside of that segment. And so I believe if we wish to have a democracy, we have to see what those targeted information streams are, because we're living in divergent realities. And we can't even go in there and pay for ads to counter that speech if we don't know the speech is taking place.
I'm going to add darkness to something that we otherwise might feel good about. I'm watching President Zelensky use social media in a way that I think is incredible and in some ways unprecedented. And it's basically turning the camera on yourself and using the selfie as a form of authenticity. And you've seen this. You've seen this in press conferences. He starts at the window and shows Kyiv, and then he walks to his desk, and then it cuts to a normal press conference. It's this sense of, I am here just the same way that you are out in the world. You are listening to me, a human being experiencing this terrible situation. I expect that to be exploited to an incredible degree by the disinformation community in the near future. I am glad that someone, for the right reasons, is using this technique. It works incredibly well for us. We are wired to pay attention to what feels like that authentic personal voice, and I expect it to be abused if it is not already being abused.
I feel like that's already also happening too with lots of, lots of live streaming stuff. I mean, it's just like that technique I see in those types, far right kind of spaces.
I haven't seen it weaponized to be the mainstream. So far, there's the weaponization of sort of false authority, right? We've had a theme throughout this of medical mis and disinformation. I think that's actually been extremely powerful in terms of saying, here's who I am, here's what my status, I'm going to build on this. I expect it to be more about presence, authenticity, the camera facing yourself to be the main goal for it.
Erin, you had
Yes, taking the point that imagining better social media actually is a long-term thing, and that harm reduction now is going to be really important heading into 2022. It's a little bit of a ballgame after 2020, what we're going to be seeing, especially with Ukraine and everything else that's gone down in the pandemic. A couple of things, I'll double down on greater transparency. I think equity among languages, if they're adding context or friction, we need those in all languages that are spoken on the platform in the United States with moderators in the United States aware of the cultural context. And then amplification checks, right? Like, if it's being paid for or if you're making money off of amplifying it, like, once things start picking up, like, we need them to be getting in there sooner. Like, we don't want another plandemic, but for the 2022 elections.
I would say one other really tactical thing is we deserve to have, like, just how Twitter has like 1/10 of all the tweets, like Facebook could be putting out streams of accounts that are acting in coordination. Like, they clearly are not willing to staff enough people to vet these things. Like, having a public stream where you say these people all have high reach and they're coordinated sets of accounts, we should look at them. That would allow independent researchers to at least chip in.
Cecilia, how do you think about covering this too?
Oh, covering it. Well,
or whatever you were going to say.
no, I'll go to the covering it question. So this is the whole focus of technology reporting. It's not about gadgets and, cool new product releases and upgrades. It's about accountability is what we call it, and through the lens of these being the most powerful entities really right now in our society, both financially as well as political clout, et cetera. So it's a huge priority. As far as the election goes, again, this is another example of where these are voluntary measures taken by the company. So you're probably going to see, companies take different tacks. It's usually Twitter's first, and then the other companies follow, and they're a little bit more willing to be experimental. But they have said they're willing to put more resources, obviously, into it, bigger security staff. We'll see. But I do think that you can't underestimate friction, as Erin said, just like that one example, that pop-up that says, you didn't read the story, you sure you want to retweet it? Like that's big, you know? And friction and transparency, and again, these sound kind of mundane, but for us to see why things go viral, to understand, for example, in the days after 2020, nobody knew this until this was reported by the New York Times and others, that Facebook changed the ranking systems behind the newsfeed to prioritize, they call it the nicer newsfeed, to prioritize more authoritative news sources than more fringe and polarizing news sources. And that had an effect. It actually slowed the spread of misinformation around the election. To know that many months later was interesting. It would be good to have the ability to understand that either real time or even after, and not being reported out just because reporters were really good at digging out that information, but to have that voluntarily released or compelled in some way, that kind of information.
Yeah, it's also going to be a scary, tumultuous time, I imagine. We're about at time. I want to thank everyone here. Unless you have a closing note on this.
Can I end on a happy note?
Okay, fine.
Good.
It's kind of off brand for me, but we.
I always end on a happy note. Anyone who's been to one of my civil society things. Okay, so we have done this over and over and over again. Like every new communications technology is not neutral. It's not neutral. And sometimes it takes us a while to figure out like what's going wrong with it. Like this happened with the printing press. It happened with the cheap printing press, also known as newspapers. It happened with radio, like Hitler rose to power largely on the back of radio, Rwanda, bad TV. It happens every single time. And the reason why it feels weird to us now is because this is our crisis. And this is like our burden to figure out what do we do. And it's really hard to go into white spaces where we don't know what to do next. But we've done it before. We've done it over and over again. Humans are very clever. We get out over our skis, but we will figure it out. And I believe in us. We just have to keep pushing for it.
That was way better than how I was going to end it.
Sorry.
Anyway, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the IOP. Yeah.
That was good.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage David Axelrod and Jeffrey Goldberg.
That was nice. Yeah. Good touch.
Thank you. David.
Yes, Jeff. No, there's not going to be any singing involved, don't worry.
Unless you want singing, in which case, well, yeah, no, you don't. You really don't. Just wanted to say, on behalf of the Atlantic, a couple of things before I turn it over to David. First of all, thank you to David for calling me up. It seems like just a couple of months ago. It was not long, and saying maybe we should do a conference on disinformation, and here we are, and I think it's been wildly successful, thanks to David first and foremost. By the usual measurements, I think this has been very successful. I think we're coming out knowing more than we knew coming in. I think we got some great speakers, sometimes agreeing with each other, sometimes not. I think one darkly humorous but inevitable measurement of our success is that our disinformation conference has been the subject of disinformation campaigns on social media already. So yeah. Congratulate yourselves for that. We'll study that at next year's disinformation. Let me just say a couple of thank yous, and I just want to make sure I get everybody. One of the things that's been a real joy for us at the Atlantic has been working with the IOP team, getting to know the IOP team. I don't think this is an exaggeration to say that we do these things fairly often. We've never worked with a team this generous, calm, smart, clever, creative. Really, just a joy. Christine Hurley, first. Where's Christine? The maestro. Yeah. Tell her to come in the room. Yeah.
There she is.
There she is. David, yeah, that was just fantastic work. David whispered something to me about a raise. I don't know what it was. I don't know what he was referring to, but you might want to have at your 4 o'clock meeting.
By the Atlantic.
Yeah,
That was really generous.
Aaron Simpson, multi-talented. Aaron Simpson, Jennifer Steinauer, Joel Ebert, Karan Addo, and of course Zinat Rahman, who is the executive director of IOP. Where is she? Oh, hi. Right in front of me. I was looking in the
She moves around.
Really great getting to know all of you, Zinat and everybody, and just a tremendous experience putting this on with you. And we hope that we come out of here with, from our purposes, with new ideas for journalism, new ideas for coverage that I'm not really much into the solutions journalism model. I like the problem journalism model better, but I'm happy to publish pieces that actually provide some kind of a roadmap out. I guess I'm feeling optimistic based on that last that last moment. But we're delighted to get to know all of you. And David, again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. You know, there's this old proverb about I'd sooner light candles than curse the darkness. I think we just spent 3 days recognizing the darkness, but trying to light candles. And that last panel was the perfect way to end this discussion, because this is not a futile exercise. There are things that we can do. There is a better way. And our hope is that people will leave here energized to pursue those, as we will leave here energized to pursue them. We all have agency in this room, and we should use it, because this is a critical challenge for us, and we have to meet it. So we had this idea in the summer. It seemed ambitious, and this conference has outstripped all of my expectations, and it has for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, the partnership with the Atlantic, and I just want to commend Jeff, not just for what you and your team have done here, but for your commitment on the broader issue of democracy and the challenges that we face. You're lighting candles. And I really urge people to read the wonderful work the Atlantic continues to do. I want to say more about your team in a second. I want to thank the Benti Carl, I get I get nervous on this. The Benti Volio a family fund for. I got to ask you about the provenance of that. Why couldn't it have been the Smith family fund?
Bentivolio. What is the problem?
Bentivolio. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes. Please travel with me. The Joyce Foundation and the Crankstart Foundation, without whom we could not have put this conference on. And yes, I just have to add my thanks. I could not be more proud of my team here at the IOP, and I appreciate the recognition that you've given them. I'm in awe of you guys, and I'm so grateful. And to the Atlantic team, to Emily Gottschalk-Marconi, Ellen Cushing. Woo. Yes, give them a hand. Anna Bross and Adrienne LaFrance. These two teams have been speaking weekly for months and months and months to make this happen. And it's the combined resources that they brought to the conversation that has made this the conference that it is. The other thing and the last thing that I want to say is that all of you have made this the conference that it is. Those who've participated in these discussions on the stage and all the discussions that have gone on off the stage. And it's been inspiring to watch not just our students, but all the people who have come in from around the country who have a deep interest in this issue, attending these sessions, paying close attention, asking extraordinarily good questions. That also gives me hope. So thank you all for participating. I hope that this is just the first of many collaborations between the IOP and the Atlantic, and that together, with all our combined resources, everyone in this room, that the next time we get together, we'll celebrate real, marked progress on this issue. Thank you. I guess we should say there are boxed lunches out there. So for those of you who want one more meal, it's waiting for you.